Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about things that affect at least most of Asia, definitely not Singapore. I think you've got your act together, but one aspect that we tend as city planners and politicians to often ignore is the condition of the inner cities. And in most of Asia, the inner cities, the historic cores, are both the centers of the historic fabric of the city, and yet they're mostly ghettoized. Unlike Europe, where declining populations actually eases the burden on the infrastructure of these historic town centers, in Asia we have an implosion of population. So whether it's Colombo or Delhi or Hyderabad or right across the entire continent, we have the whole issue of these inner city areas that face perhaps one of the greatest challenges of urbanization in this region. And while the world globalizes, while internationalism and globalization are the buzzwords, what we're also seeing is a gradual Coca-Colization of Asia, in a sense. We have new brands coming in, and we have, the same cookie cutter new buildings of aluminum and glass coming up in Asia. Whether that's appropriate environmentally or not is a completely different debate. But are we, in fact, losing the identity of our cities? Given the next 2 decades, how would you differentiate the inner city areas of Bhaktapur or Kathmandu or Colombo or Mumbai or Delhi? Because all we are getting in our little towns and cities are new concrete buildings and glass, and that's what we are celebrating. So in this race for modernization, globalization, and sort of to become the new power centers, are we really losing what is uniquely our own, and that is the Asian identity of our cities? And that's where we come to this whole issue of traditions of planning that we grew up with and that were ingrained in our cultures. We've had for centuries a certain inherent planning of our cities, whether you take Jodhpur and Jaisalmer, which were unified by the very fact that they used the same materials. So the color of the stone, whether it was golden sandstone in Jaisalmer or whether it was a pink stucco lime in Jaipur, this really became an underlying pattern of urban planning. The length of the window or the length of the opening was really was defined by the span of the stone beam or the wooden lintel, and therefore there became a uniformity in our building textures. Without bylaws and codes that were codified, there was a system that did tie our cities together. And what we're seeing today, whether it's great sites like Miyajima, but what happens is this. And in all our historic city centers, in all our historic sites, our cultural destinations, we are creating this synthetic plastic environment of loud banners, neon signs, electrical posts, and losing what was intrinsically the character of our historic sites. And I firmly believe that whether it's a small town or a large city, there are really 3 realms to a city. The first realm is the one that's most tangible, that's the physical realm. So you have your buildings, your bridges, your roads, what physically can be defined. The other realm is the functional realm. Is your city a manufacturing city, or is it a city of culture? Is it a city of, is a capital city? Is it a political city? So that really becomes the functional realm. But eventually, the most important aspect of a city beyond all this is really the psychological realm. And if we see, even if we look at in my city of Mumbai, if we just trace something like random terrorist attacks in the last 10 years, you would realize that our terrorist attacks have specifically targeted the Gateway of India twice, the Taj Mahal Hotel, the Victoria Terminus World Heritage Site. And why is it that all these terrorist attacks were though random, specifically aimed at cultural sites. And that's because cultural sites and historic sites are really what form our psychological realm, because it's easiest to target a cultural icon. I mean, from 9/11 to in Bombay, what we call 26/11, it's really iconic architectural or historic or city icons that are targeted, because eventually the citizens have a psychological connect with these. And therefore it becomes all the more important to be able to address those issues. Apart from the whole idea of this implication of the way we've had a mismanagement of the whole overlay of infrastructure on historic city centers. And yet, I speak at least for Asia, when we look at a region where we're still grappling with public health, with basic food for all, education, and very fundamental issues of livelihood, to talk about culture and heritage and conservation always seems to be a bit bit utopian. We're always very low on the agenda. We have a politician here on our panel, but for politicians, culture becomes really something that's scraping the bottom. It's not important enough, it doesn't get enough votes, and if you talk about restoring a building, it doesn't get you the same vote bang than if you were to say free computers or laptops for all students or something like that. And that's why it becomes all the more important to be able to position it, because if in the next 2 5-year plans, culture does not reflect strongly in our regions, in a decade, the kind of loss and the vanishing heritage that we are seeing is going to be so irrevocable that it's going to be then impossible to bring back or to retain anything which has already been lost. And that's why we have to realize that we need to view management of cultural resources as an asset and not a liability. And one of the main reasons, again in the region, has been the monument-centric approach that our planners have always approached our heritage with. In India, we are obsessed with the Taj Mahal. A minor yellowing of the marble would get you headlines in newspapers. There have been raging debates on whether one of the minarets has been tilted by 10 millimeters, and there are parliament questions about what the Archaeological Survey of India is doing. And in spite of this being a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's so odd that not once have the planners and the archaeologists sat together to define and broaden the buffer zone. So as far as the Government of India policy goes, the 200-meter around the Taj Mahal is a sort of a imaginative barrier that they want to protect. But at the end of the day, across the river, any kind of construction is possible because we haven't planned to include it in our buffer. This was really going to happen. It's not a joke, because we forgot as a nation that the buffer across the river was to be included. And in about 10 years ago, there was a plan floated by the state government to create what they call the Taj Heritage Corridor. And in India, we just use the word heritage to say anything and get away with it. So we have heritage hotels, which are brand new and in concrete. And this was going to have malls and shopping centers and theaters and offices right across the river. And that's when the government woke up and said, oh my God, there's no way we can save this because we really haven't included it in the buffer. So the idea of a visual boundary hasn't yet translated on our planning norms, and we still struggle with these imaginary radius and circles of 100 and 200 meters. And had it not been for some citizens who filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, this would have gone through. The same story exists. Our National Monuments Act actually defines a monument as at least being 100 years old. It defines that you need to have a boundary. So if you look closely, this is a 15th century tomb. It's got a little fence 1 meter away from the tomb. So as far as our policymakers goes, we've secured the site. There's a 1 meter boundary. Every evening, the watchman locks it and goes home for a sound sleep. Well, right across it, we have an electric substation, a public toilet, a truck terminal, and a public urinal. So we've got everything, including a pawn shop that is ready, spittoon to sort of target your stone walls. And that's why the disconnect between the planners and the policymakers is really causing something of a disaster and creating these schizophrenic pockets of historic cities. This is New Delhi. We've got Shah Jahanabad, historic city in 1857, the Mughal city, and overnight you have these aluminum-clad structures that come up everywhere. You know, the kind of just underground trunking of electric cables would help this site. In Jaisalmer, we have this amazing sandstone structure, fabulous city, and you can now barely see it because of the signboards. One amazingly crazy policy actually suggested road widening schemes in historic areas, and therefore we lost out the most important streetscape of historic Havelis in Hyderabad, because someone who was sitting on a board and didn't really get down to the site just suggested urban road widening, and that just meant that all these buildings were lopped off and we lost our heritage. Same story with solid waste management, poor zoning, industrial zones in historic areas, and that's when you begin to feel the kind of time bomb we're sitting on. This is a high seismic zone in the Himalayas, and the kind of construction activity to respond to a burgeoning population is something which is just a ticking time bomb, because one earthquake of 5 Richter scale is enough to kill millions of people. And that's when we need to sort of regroup. And Bombay looked at this because we were at the bottom of the spectrum. The entire city of Mumbai does not have one national protected site. Most of its architecture is less than 100 years old. It's very similar in that sense to Singapore. So the rest of India doesn't even look upon Bombay as a historic city. It's like, what? You call yourself a heritage city? Here we've got, you know, monuments which are 4,000 years old, and you've got these Victorian and Art Deco buildings that you're worrying about. And because even something like the Victoria Terminus station was not good enough to be listed as a national monument, I think it gave the city a completely different direction. And then in Mumbai, we went not top down, but bottom up. So in about 10 years ago, with just about $1,000, we managed to start a project called the Horniman Circle Revival Project. These were buildings which were subtenanted under rent control, and just a shoestring budget just to clean up the facades happened completely through public-private funding, not a penny from the government. We managed to clean up these, get them in shape. This area, the Kala Ghoda, the citizens came up with an organization called the Kala Ghoda Association. All we asked the government was to allow us 2 weekends of pedestrian area around this. We started in 1998 a cultural festival for 2 weeks in February, which is a good time of the year. Figured out there were already 15 galleries and cultural institutions, put them on one single calendar, and had free concerts. So we got the finest classical musicians to perform free and did not charge anything, and then all we got was $100,000, of which we decided to restore this public building, which is government owned. So the first MOU happened between a citizens group and the government, and we said, you haven't done anything about your building, so let us restore it. And Elphinstone College was restored. We took the Dadabhai Naoroji Road, planned for it, and this is what it was. It was just completely cluttered with shop fronts. It took me 9 months to draw elevations of every building because there were no drawings with the municipal corporation. We mapped every little air conditioning unit, every signage, every shop sign on the facades, and created simple tools like this. This was a visual tool which shows 3 boards, 3 arches. And I went literally every Wednesday and Friday to the shopkeepers and talked to them one-on-one and said, can you just move your shop signs so we have 3 boards and 3 signs? My husband thought I was stark raving mad because there was no government support. And finally, the way we shamed McDonald's is, I took them pictures of McDonald's on Bond Street and McDonald's near the Parthenon and said, see, you've got this tiny M which is hardly visible, and just because you think we're a third world country, you can get away with it. They finally agreed to move their sign, and in decades we'd not seen these arches in our city because they'd completely plastered over. It was something that was a small initiative. It took no money because there was no government support, but complete persistence paid off. So even these multiple tenanted buildings where there was just a clutter of shop signs were cleaned up. We then filed a public interest litigation in court and said that in historic precincts, why are billboards being allowed? And we won this when the High Court ruled in our favor, and we were able to get rid of these. But the great thing was there were buildings we'd never seen. In 50 years, we'd never seen this building, and I wondered what the occupants did, because they mustn't have ever got sunlight in 50 years. So we managed to get rid of a lot of this, and that then incentivized a lot of building owners to put money and restore their facades. So this was all done with not one penny spent through government. And then we came up with this idea of street furniture that was cast iron and Victorian, and we made every shopkeeper pay for the street furniture outside his shop. So even if it were a small shop selling suitcases to a large bank on the road, each one paid for the street furniture outside theirs, and that gave a sense of ownership. So if I have put as a shopkeeper money, and if I see someone spitting on that shop sign or the street furniture, I'm going to go out and hold that man and say, you better not do this. And I think that buy-in was essential, because when the government puts in things, people really don't care how it's maintained. We still have challenges. We still have a lot of areas that need conservation. We still have a lot of funding issues. But I think in Mumbai, because we were not on the government radar, it gave us a completely different attitude towards conservation. So we don't really wait around for government doles. We just do it ourselves. Thank you.